Hey, pushers. So, before we leave LBJ, let's go ahead and spend some time talking about the hippies. So, the hippies are a short term name for the Jenny and Forrest generation, who was the first, as we've said before, the first generation to grow up middle class, majority middle class. First generation to see large numbers of kids going to college. They're going to be launching a social revolution in the United States that really is against their parents, Joe and Rosie. And so the baby boomers, as they're called, ironically, actually were the more progressive as compared to their parents. They're the ones who are going to stage all the protests. They're going to be the ones to launch this social revolution. A revolution that includes advancements of minority rights, women's rights, as well as protests against Vietnam, protests against, basically wrongdoing in general. So, let's go ahead and get started with the social revolution of the 1960s. So it was a generational gap, a gap between Joe and Rosie on one end, that's the World War II generation, versus their kids, the baby boomers. And that's the Jenny and Forrest generation. And so this generational divide were different in terms of their values. Their values are going to be very different. Their moral compass will be very different, and behavior will be very different. So let's talk first about the boomers. The boomers, the Jenny and Forrests, they have very negative attitudes towards authority because growing up middle class and somewhat privileged, they didn't like the idea of authority telling them what to do. And so they tended to reject authority, reject traditional values, the values held by the World War II generation. And these are very traditional, very nationalistic values. Old world values where racism was kind of just the status quo. Women were second class citizens. Um, the United States was the greatest culture and the greatest, greatest country. That was the value system of the World War II generation. By today's standards, they are a bit racist, sexist, certainly imperialist, oppressive. And as a result of that, this boomer generation looked at their parents' generation and became disillusioned and said, you know what, all this whitewashed American history, where, we're the greatest country and all this kind of stuff, that's all a bunch of malarkey, right? This is the point of view of the boomer generation. And so they're going to reject those traditional values. They're going to reject the moral compass of the World War II generation. Um, and there's also a religious divide. As we've seen, the boomers are tending to reject traditional religion, as opposed to the World War II generation that embraced religion. So, what we see among young people in the 1960s was religious skepticism. Remember how we kind of started the year talking about religious skepticism that led to the First Great Awakening? Well, we're going to see something very similar happen. This religious skepticism of the 1960s and 70s are going to lead to a religious revival in the 1980s and 90s. So we're going to see the same thing happening again. All right. So what really was the catalyst behind the protest movement? The answer is Vietnam. Vietnam radicalized the boomer middle class college student, and this led to the formation of what is known, and as part of the social revolution, it's called the counterculture. This goes against culture, goes against traditional culture. So the boomers were the counterculture, going against the culture of the status quo, the norm of the World War II generation. The counterculture indulged in radical political protest, um, got very political, criticizing the government often. There was a lot of drug usage, including LSD, amongst the counterculture. There was also a rebellion against traditional music, so we're going to see the beginnings of main, becoming mainstream rock and roll, acid rock, this kind of stuff. And a lot of the music of the 1960s was very radicalized. It was very politically protest oriented. Um, Very much not trusting in the old generation, not trusting in the values of the old generation. There's going to be experimentation in forming utopian societies, much like we saw in the antebellum reform movements, where we have communes, where people could basically do their own thing, rejecting the traditional family values of mom, dad, and brother, sister, right? They rejected those family values. So hippies were basically young men and young women, these boomer generations, who defied tradition instead of, you know, GI Joe with his buzz cut and his military style. Instead, uh, Forrest is gonna dress with long hair and maybe even earrings, right? Instead of, suits, gray suits, we're gonna see jeans and t-shirts. Young women rejected the short hair of the that women were wearing in the 1940s and 50s, and instead grew it out long and without any kind of curlers or any kind of product, just kind of letting it go natural, not wearing it pinned up or bound up. Women also didn't wear those girdles anymore and the all the undergarments. Instead, they would wear jeans just like the men. So this was a, believe it or not, jeans became kind of the symbol of rebellion. And so, one of the biggest counterculture destinations was in California, specifically in San Francisco. And I'm going to get even more specific. There was a street corner that tended to congregate hippies, all the kids that maybe have left home and kind of wanted to go and join the hippie populations. It was in the corner of Haight and Ashbury, which was in San Francisco, and this kind of became a destination at that corner. And there was a huge movement that happened there. And as you can see here, many protests against the government. So, because many of the hippies were also college kids, we're going to start to see a new left student organization, one of the most radical student organizations in U.S. history, called the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society. And they were radical because they eventually became violent. Now, at first, their platform was about anti poverty and anti war. And a lot of anti war protests often took place in universities, right, in colleges. We'll be talking, about Kent State, and we've already talked about the University of Alabama, University of Mississippi, and all of the attempts to integrate those southern universities. So the SDS, there were chapters in most universities in the 1960s, and they would give administration long lists of non-negotiable demands, including greater student control over the campuses. Because what started to happen as more and more protests were happening, administration started to crack down, and eventually it came down in many universities that political debate wasn't even allowed to be discussed on college campuses. So there was a movement against that for some greater student control. The protests took on many forms, including borrowing from the labor movement, the sit-ins. Remember, that's where you go in and you just sit down and you don't move. Strikes as well, boycotts. These were all used by the SDS in forms of protest. Soon, the SDS became kind of violent. And I'll talk more about that in a second. I'm just going to give you an example of a movement largely sponsored by the SDS. It's the free speech movement. And it started really in California, the University of California at Berkeley. And students objected to administration's ban on political debate on college campuses. So they staged sit ins and protests, and it was known as the free speech movement, largely started by Mario Savio. He was the founder of the free speech movement. And they, again, like I said before, they used sit ins, they used boycotts and teach ins. Oops. Um, did I skip something? No. Okay. Also, part of the social revolution was uh, also a sexual revolution. So Jenny and Forrest, like I said, were rejecting the traditional family values of Joe and Rosie, And so they kind of said, hey, let's, with the advent of birth control pills, let's start fighting for the use of birth control pills because in many states it was banned. So there was a lot of protest and movement about that. Having sex before marriage, all of these things, rejecting the traditional values of Joe and Rosie. Another aspect of the sexual revolution was gay rights movement, and one of the biggest milestones in the gay rights movement was the Stonewall Inn riots. So this was in 1969, and Stonewall was a gay bar in Greenwich Village in New York City. And in 1969, it was often raided by police, just raided, because there were a lot of laws, anti-gay laws. Like it was illegal essentially to be gay and to be engaging in gay activities. So police would often go in and raid gay bars. But one night in 1969, off-duty police brutally attacked a lot of the patrons at the Stonewall Inn in New York City. And this became kind of a calling cry, and it energized the gay rights movement. And so we do see Gay Liberation Front. We see all these protesting against the elimination of all these laws. All these laws that essentially put particularly gay men in prison. Uh, and to this day, the Stonewall Inn, as you can see in the middle of the photo here, is now a historic site and is often the site of gay parades in New York City. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move into minority rights in general, various types of minorities. And here's the end result. Minority rights in the 1960s have been revived, but had limited success. Some more successful than others, some with very limited success. So let's talk about all the protests by the young people, particularly SDS. And what we started to see is that these youth revolutions, as we go into the 1970s, they kind of go from being peaceful to being violent. For example, the SDS, this is the example I've been using, the Students for a Democratic Society. There was a branch of it that broke off called the Weathermen. And the Weathermen were a very radical, violent organization that would often incite riots and that kind of thing. So again, this movement started to become much more radicalized. So the long-term effects in general of the 1960s protest movements was that it was populated mostly by the baby boomers, and the protests was against Vietnam, also against discrimination, whether it be sexual discrimination or minority, African American discrimination. And a lot of the reason why these kids were protesting is because they had the time. They didn't have responsibilities. They were in college. The economy was prosperous, right? Everything was going well. But then as we go into the 1970s, the economy takes a severe downturn. These college kids are now graduating and getting jobs, and the responsibility of adulthood and all of that kind of ends a lot of the movement in the social revolution. Vietnam also ended, and so that's also going to contribute to basically the end of the social revolution. All right, so, but before it ends, let's just kind of talk about various minorities that had limited success. Let's start with Native Americans. So I'm going to have to take us back in time. The last time we talked about Native Americans was probably around Wounded Knee. And that was when we had the the Dawes Severalty Act, which was an assimilation policy, where no more reservations. That all ended with the ghost dance and all of that in the late 1800s. So, so basically, what happened after that, after the Dawes Severalty Act, in in the 1930s, there was a guy. You can kind of see him in that picture, standing next to those Native Americans. His name was John Collier, and this was in the 1930s, right around the time of the New Deal. He became Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and it turns out he was very progressive. He wanted to end all these assimilation policies. He wanted to bring about more pride in traditional Native American cultures. And so from the 1930s to 1946, he was a big advocate for Native American rights. But then he retired in 1946, and the federal policy then reverted back to assimilation. And part of that included the Indian termination policy. This is the withdrawal of all official recognition of tribes as legal entities. So this was, this big let's go back to assimilating into white society, no more Native American cultures and rights, all that. And the Indian termination policy is an example of that. So Native Americans began fighting for those rights, right? They kept saying, no, 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 we don't want to assimilate. We want our traditional Native American cultures. So youthful Native Americans of various different tribes united in what is known as the American Indian Movement, or AIM. So these were the boomers of the Native American Society. And so they formed various organizations, including AIM, that called for intertribal unity. Let's unite together, something we have not been able to do in the past, against white oppression. So AIM did a lot of things, including, various types of protests, occupying Alcatraz at one point in order to get awareness for this issue. And finally, they had some success here. In 1968, Congress passed the Indian Civil Rights Act, which did guarantee the reservation Indians many of the protections accorded to other citizens by the Bill of Rights, but which also recognized the legitimacy of tribal laws within reservations. So this was some limited success here for Native Americans with the passage of the Indian Civil Rights Act in 1968. All right, Nate, let's talk about Latin Americans. So I'm going to talk about Latin Americans coming from different parts. We know that with the 1964 Immigration Act, we started to see an opening up of immigrants coming into the United States, particularly in Asia and Latin America. So I'm going to focus in on Latin America. Puerto Rico, of course, has long been a protectorate of the United States. And so we're going to see Puerto Rican might immigrate to the United States, particularly staying in eastern cities like in New York City. And it was because of their territorial status, right? So we did see some Puerto Ricans coming a lot. But the fastest growing minority were Puerto Ricans in the 1960s and 70s. Also coming into the United States in the 1960s were Cubans. And they were coming not for very different reasons. Remember that Castro had converted Cuba into a communist country. And when he did that, he took away property. So many middle-class Cubans who just got all of their property revoked said, screw this, we're going to the United States. So there was a huge brain drain happening in Cuba. Mostly upper and middle-class people with property leaving Cuba to come to the United States. And so we had a huge influx of Cubans coming in the 1960s. There was a second wave of Cubans coming. Castro closed the door down when so many middle and upper class Cubans, educated Cubans left. So he closed the door in the 1970s, but then opened it up in the 1980s in the second wave of Cuban migration called the Merlietos. And this is named for the port from which they left Cuba. And it was basically poor. With that window opening, many poor Cubans left coming to the United States in the Merlieto boat launch. Okay, now let's go to Mexican. We also see a large number of Mexicans. We had a large number of Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and Mexicans. So let's give a little bit of the background, which you already know about Mexicans. So Mexicans were encouraged to come to the United States during World War II in the Braceros program. You may remember that because there were labor shortages and we needed people to work. So the U.S. government worked with the Mexican government to bring many Mexicans to the United States so that they can work in factories. And many of them remained after World War II in the cities of the Southwest and the Pacific Coast. After the war, the contract expired, but many immigrants continue to come in. Mexicans continue to come into the United States legally and illegally. So both legally and illegally. And so by the 1960s, Mexican Americans was one of the largest population groups in the West, and they're going to call for rights. So young Mexican American activists began calling themselves Chicanos in order to emphasize all Spanish speakers, right, to unite together. and most of them worked in agricultural industry because that's what they were brought in for largely in the Proceris program. So they remained agricultural workers, but as we know, agricultural workers were very, very, very low paid. So Cesar Chavez, he was basically a union leader, and he wanted to raise wages for farm workers. So he formed the United Farm Workers, the UFW, a largely Chicano organization, and it launched a prolonged strike against growers to demand, of course, recognition of the union, but also increased wages and benefits. And it was a peaceful protest. They would often use boycotts, marches, community organizations. Cesar Chavez famously went on a hunger strike that even Robert Kennedy came and talked to them. You can see that photo here, gaining a lot of national recognition for the movement. And by July 1970, the UFW had succeeded in reaching a collective bargaining agreement with one agricultural industry, the grape growers, and as a result of that, it affected 10,000 farm workers. So this was a positive movement. It was just with the grape growers, but some other growers also agreed to collective bargaining, but not all. Again, limited success. Women. So I know it's hard for us to believe today that women were considered second class citizens. Women were not able to get their own credit card without a man co signing for them. Women couldn't take out loans without a man co signing for them. Certainly, there were no equal wages. Women were often denied registration at universities. It was a different time, for sure. So there was a women's liberation movement called NOW, meaning the National Organization for Women. And this organization was of young women who wanted to achieve equal status, right, in the United States. So NOW became the nation's largest and most influential feminist organizations. And in 1971, the government extended its affirmative action guidelines that it had instituted in the 1960s to also include women, linking sexism with racism. And nearly half of all married women held jobs by the mid 1970s, and almost 9/10 of all women with college degrees had jobs. Not equal paying jobs, but jobs, right? Um, Another big name in the women's liberation movement is Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique, and it was kind of a bomb that was launched in terms of making women aware of the fact that they were indeed second class citizens, and that Rosie doesn't necessarily. Why is Rosie, taking all kinds of prescription antidepressants because she's sad because her life is terrible. She doesn't want that life. So Betty Friedan in the book basically says, hey, look, you're sad not because you've got some sort of problem, but because society has told you this is what you're supposed to want and you don't want it. So she kind of launches that the feminist liberation movement. As a result of a lot of the work of NOW, in 1963, we see the passage of the Equal Pay Act, which barred the pervasive practice of paying women less than men for equal work, but only in certain jobs. Not every job. It wasn't across the board. Still isn't. So, again, limited success. Now let's finish up with the environment. So, at the time, no one was concerned about the environment. Industrialization leads to environmental degradation. And as long as big companies were making money and people had jobs, no one cared about the environment. It was such a status quo thing that even the science of ecology had absolutely no credibility. It was like witchcraft, right? It was about as credible as astrology. Um, and so what we started to see happening is people becoming aware of the vast amount of environmental problems that we were having. And so the new science of ecology started gaining credibility, largely funded by government agencies, funded by universities, by various foundations, and eventually even corporations started to embrace the idea of ecological science. And it gradually became a legitimate field of study. Also, adding to the idea that we should be paying attention to the environment and studying the environment were environmental advocacy groups and other types of NGOs, non governmental organizations like the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy. And these organizations did lots of independent research on various parts of the country and studying, the pollution in rivers and air and that kind of thing. And then scientists figuring out ways to remediate some of these problems. And so soon a government started coming to these advocacy groups that had already done the research and said, "Hey, let me look at your papers. Let me look at your and let's form policy to try and fix the environment." So let me just kind of lay out for you how bad the environment was. This is a picture of Denver, Colorado. Yeah, the air pollution was a big problem in many large cities like LA and Denver. There was something called smog. It was basically fog, but smoke fog, and the smoke belching out of factories and other types of emissions from cars and trucks and things like that were totally unregulated. And so it became such a perpetual fact of life that upper respiratory disorders were so common, that they were, people even didn't even seek treatment for it because it was seemed to be so common. Smog sometimes even blotted out the sun, where it looked like it was dusk all day long. So people are like, I don't think this is normal. So let's do something to check the unchecked industrial development that is happening. Water pollution was also a major problem. I know we've all heard about Flint, Michigan, and the lead in the water system, but water pollution had been a big problem in a lot of the major cities, where the water was discolored and it had a foul odor to it. Rivers and lakes were polluted. Medical industries were dumping biological waste in rivers. It was just really bad. So things got so bad, even on the daily weather report, they would tell you the level of acid rain, which was acid rain. I don't know if I've explained this before, but it basically, water molecules up in the atmosphere bond with the air pollution molecules, and then when it rains down, it changes the acidity of the rain, and so the rain became acid. And I remember when I was a kid that, along with the weather report of what the temperature is and what the chances of rain, they'd also have the level of acid rain, which of course would affect plant life, vegetation, farms, that kind of thing, not to mention skin irritations. So as a result, we see a movement towards, hey, maybe we should clean the environment. So the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970, and the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972. And this was, again, governmental tools against environmental degradation. Earth Day was also instituted on April 22nd, the first Earth Day, 1970. People all over the United States gathered in schools and universities, churches and clubs, and celebrated Earth Day. Just to raise awareness of the need and the need and the support for preserving the earth, right? Preserving our environment. All right, I think this is it. Yeah, that's it. All right, guys, I'll see you next time, and we will be moving to our next president. Stay safe.